What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those who are watching for the first time, my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China, and that's what we discuss on here 2 times a week. So if you're interested in geopolitical, economic, political, whatever developments coming out of China at the macro level, and you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, it's good to see you guys. Thank you for your understanding last week with the shorter episode. Unfortunately, this week I have another business trip and I'm leaving on Friday, so I simply will not have the time to put together a full end of week episode. So this week there is only going to be this episode, this mid-week episode, and it is coming out a little bit later because work is just so crazy busy, but I did want to get something up this week for you guys. So I think we can just jump into this week's episode. There won't be one this weekend, but hopefully from next week it will be back to normal 2 episodes a week. If you enjoyed the episode, guys, don't forget to smash that like button. It really does help the channel, and my details for my Patreon are below for anyone who wants to go that extra mile. But with all that said and done, let's just jump into this week's China Update. Okay, first up, assuming US President Donald Trump is unsuccessful in his legal challenges, it appears that the next US president will be Joseph Biden. Now, there have been hundreds of articles recently discussing what a President Biden would mean for the China-US relationship, as well as how the Chinese themselves, the Chinese elites and regular Chinese have reacted to the recent US election. Now, I think it's way too early at this point to make any conclusions regarding the trajectory of the future US-China relationship under a President Biden. We do have to see what the first few actions he makes when he enters the White House are. Regarding how the Chinese themselves view the elections, obviously there is a diversity of opinions here, like anywhere, but if I was to simplify the feeling among the elite, at least, the economic and political elite, then I sense it's something like this. One, it doesn't matter who is in the White House, the US establishment has already decided to keep China down, so we must continue on the road of self-reliance and assume a hostile environment. And 2, however, despite all this, a Biden may be easier to deal with than a Trump and more predictable, and this may buy the Chinese side some time. In an interview with state media this week, Jin Songrong, assistant dean of the School of International Studies at Renmin University in Beijing, said, quote, "Relations may still worsen, but not as quickly," end quote. And quote, "We should not put too much expectation on Biden because to contain and confront China is a strategic consensus between the 2 parties in the United States," end quote. Da Wei, director of the Center for Strategic and International Security Studies at the University of International Relations, again in Beijing, wrote in a piece this week, quote, "Biden's China policy will be built upon the Trump era," end quote. Now, the state media narrative, the state-run media narrative, has been that the US under a Trump administration has pursued an aggressive China containment policy or an anti-China policy, and that in an attempt to deflect blame for the US mishandling of COVID, Trump has viciously attacked China. This is the narrative that is being pushed domestically here. Put simply, the current state of the relationship, the US-China relationship, is entirely the fault of Trump's America. Unfortunately, in my view, many in Anglophone media have adopted a similar narrative. I believe this is likely in order to undermine the Trump administration in an election year, as many of the liberal media don't particularly care for the US president at this point in time, but also maybe due to limited training and following China developments in some of these media outlets. I would argue, however, that the serious deterioration in bilateral relations between China and the US has been in the works for several years already. It began before the trade war, it began before Trump was elected into office, and was driven primarily by Chinese state behavior and overreach. Serious mistakes by the Xi administration accelerated this deterioration, and the relationship collapsed this year. Almost every point of contention in the relationship is either due to a status quo change by Beijing, e.g. Taiwan, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, etc., an established area of contention or concern that Beijing failed to respond to, e.g. IP theft, asymmetric trade access, etc., or a tit-for-tat exchange that Beijing initiated. For example, journalistic and journal expulsions, or blaming COVID on the United States military, which directly resulted in the Trump administration using the terms China virus and Wuhan virus. I would argue that it's not for the US side to quote unquote fix the relationship, but more for the PRC administration to fix the relationship. Several top diplomats and officials from China have indeed given speeches and interviews in recent months and have called for the relationship to be mended and to be fixed and to get back on the right track, etc. But in all these cases, they have insisted that the US take full responsibility for the current situation and have not indicated that they will reverse any of the status quo changes that have been made over the last few years. For this reason, I would imagine that for many policymakers in Washington, these calls for reconciliation ring hollow. The US under the current administration is indeed currently pursuing an aggressive anti-China agenda. This is true. However, what we need to keep in mind is this: the US-China relationship, which had largely on balance been healthy and positive over the last few decades, did not collapse due to anti-China policies coming out of the US, but rather the US has adopted anti-China policies because the US-China relationship collapsed. And this collapse, I would argue, was the result of years of PRC overreach and state action. This state action has also alienated other partners in the world, including European countries, Canada, Japan, India, and others. I also believe that a lot of this was avoidable. It's easy for us to look back now with perfect 2020 foresight and say that we saw everything coming. But I believe that those of us who have been following things closely enough could see a lot of this coming. This is what I wrote at the beginning of 2018, before the trade war had begun, when the mainstream view of the US-China relationship was more optimistic. I wrote, quote, "The year of the dog will represent a bad year in US-China relations. I predict that over the next 12 to 18 months, the relationship will deteriorate to a low point not seen in decades." End quote. A few months after I wrote this, the trade war started. Regarding the question of what a Biden White House would mean for China-US relations and whether this would improve the overall situation for both sides, I stand by what I wrote a few months after the last quote that I read to you guys in mid-2018. I wrote then, quote, "While the US-China conflict's current manifestation, i.e. the trade war, is a reflection of White House policy, the administration is not the root cause of the conflict itself. If Trump loses the House or his office, or if the current trade conflict is resolved, this will not fix the underlying structural issues." End quote. Okay, last week we discussed the suspension of billionaire Jack Ma's upcoming dual IPO for Ant Group, and we looked at the official and unofficial explanations of that suspension. Click up here if you want to see last week's episode, and we go in greater detail there. It seems very obvious now that the suspension was due to Ma pissing off too many officials and regulators. However, the exact details are still unknown and speculation is still rife. Some have speculated, for example, that Ma knew that the draft rules to regulate his company were coming, and that he was using his speech at the Bund Summit several weeks ago, which we covered at the time, as a platform to hit back at regulators, arguing Beijing's emphasis on preventing systemic financial risk stifled innovation in China. Others argue that the publication of the draft regulations was a result of official anger and concern that followed Ma's speech, and he did not know too much about the specific regulations in advance. Since the announcement, there has been a huge volume of opinions and stories written about Jack Ma and Ant. It's impossible to follow all of it. Literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of opinions being read tens, if not hundreds of millions of times in the mainland. But it feels like Chinese public opinion at this point towards Ma started relatively sympathetic and then swung to critical against the Chinese billionaire almost overnight. The new regulations, which are called, quote, "online microloan operations provisional administrative measures," end quote, don't just affect Ant Group either. There are more than 200 online microlenders with inter-provincial operations, which are caught by the new draft regulations released earlier last week. Many of these are owned by massive technology companies. We'll be getting onto something related to this shortly after this. According to a report by private Chinese media outlet Taishan Media, Only 4 of these over 200 micro lenders currently meet the new requirements under the draft provisions. Like I said last week, this is a big company and a lot of very powerful people have interests in it. So there's a lot of politics going on behind the scenes with this, and boy, have those with interests in the company lost a lot in potential wealth in the future due to this IPO suspension. Iris Tan, an analyst at Morningstar, said that Ant could face a 25 to 50% downside in valuation, which would mean a $140 billion reduction in value due to suspending this dual IPO. Now, while we're on this theme, on Tuesday of this week, the State Administration for Market Regulation published draft antitrust guidelines intended to tackle the dominance of some internet-based firms in their respective markets in mainland China. The 3 big tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and Meituan, they would be targets of these new regulations, but it does affect all internet companies within the mainland. Investors reacted quickly. News of the anti-monopoly draft regulations wiped out over $100 billion in value of those 3 companies that I named alone in just the first day. Chinese tech companies generally lost about $260 billion in value over 2 days, within 48 hours of the announcement of the draft regulations. The draft antitrust guidelines explain that the new regulations seek to outlaw monopolistic practices by internet platforms such as, quote, demanding vendors to transact only on one platform exclusively, or providing differentiated prices to customers based on their shopping history and profiles, end quote. In an interview with media, Scott Yu, an antitrust expert at a leading Beijing law firm, one that I actually worked with while I was working in Beijing actually, expressed the new rules, quote, signal the end of an era. It will fundamentally change the competition landscape in China for internet companies, end quote. I tend to agree. This week, the United States Department of State designated another 4 PRC officials for, quote, threatening the peace, security, and autonomy of Hong Kong, end quote. This designation will result in US sanctions against these individuals. The war of words between the US and China continues into this week. Over the last few weeks, state-run media have been publishing numerous articles daily attacking the US election and domestic situation, pushing hard the narrative of US decline. A major state-run outlet, Xinhua Media, had one article yesterday that argued in earnest that the US is, quote, no different than a failed state, end quote. On Tuesday, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave another speech highly critical of the Chinese Communist Party, saying, quote, I'll often hear we don't want to pick between the United States and China. I remind them that that's not the fight. The fight is between authoritarianism, barbarism on one side, and freedom on the other. And so we began to strengthen the institutions that can achieve this objective, from the Quad to ASEAN to NATO. We've woken up to the threat posed by the Marxist-Leninist monster, end quote. Tuesday evening, state-run CCTV Evening News had a story entitled, quote, the human rights situation in the United States has been widely criticized at the United Nations, end quote, which included, quote, China urged the US to stop interfering in other countries' internal affairs on the pretext of human rights issues for political purposes. Russia, Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and other countries also demanded that the United States immediately lift unilateral sanctions and embargoes against developing countries, end quote. According to data by the US Department of State, the number of F1 student visas granted to applicants in mainland China was approximately 800 in the 6 months through September of this year, down over 99% from the same period last year. PRC students used to make up roughly 30% of the international students in United States universities. And finally, a new book on General Secretary Xi Jinping's speeches has been published this week called, quote, On Party Propaganda and Thought Work, end quote. The book was discussed at length in Tuesday's edition of the state-run newspaper, The People's Daily. The language reminds us once again about Xi's administration's view of the central role of ideology and correct thinking and thought in state building and political stability in China. Quote, "Ideology is about the banner, the road, and the country's political security," end quote. It's also yet another sign that Xi is actually a die-in-the-wool Marxist, as opposed to the pragmatic leaders of the past that only paid lip service to Marxist pronouncements. The General Secretary said in one of his speeches quoted in the new book, quote, "Adhering to historical materialism and constantly opening up new frontiers in the development of Marxism in contemporary China. Historical materialism, as an important part of Marxist philosophy, is the science of the general laws of human social development. It is necessary to learn and master the analysis of basic social contradictions and deeply understand the importance and urgency of comprehensively deepening reform," end quote. Okay guys, that's the midweek episode for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave your comments below. I always enjoy chatting with you guys. I'm sorry that there's only one episode this week and it's a shorter one because it's midweek. But like I said, I just simply won't be able to get a video out over the weekend. But hopefully everything will be back to normal from next week. Wherever you are, as always, I hope you're keeping safe and keeping sane. I will see you guys next time on China Update.